If you are interested in exploring these topics further, learning and connecting with like-minded individuals, check out the 3 Patreon discussion groups available. Just visit theinfinitesparkofbeing.com and click the participate button. I also offer a free meditation group online every Sunday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern. Just go to any of my social media profiles for the link found in my link tree. There's no pressure to be on camera or to actively participate in any of these groups. Just come and listen and enjoy. Join an online spiritual community of everyday people committed to understanding the human experience more deeply through spiritual practices that we can apply to our everyday lives. Join us. Welcome to the Infinite Spark of Being podcast. My name is Keith Welsh, and in this episode, we're going to discuss relationships as yoga, specifically bhakti yoga. I've often wondered if relationships, dating, marriage, and all of that are where my curriculum lies, given that mine have often resulted in chaos and struggle of some sort. It's been interesting, but it wasn't until I met Christy that I really started to understand that this is, in fact, where my work needed to be. I've also learned that a relationship done consciously can be the foundation for yoga, for bhakti yoga. Bhakti in Sanskrit means devotion. Bhakti yoga is devotional yoga, and it's usually associated with this kind of deep devotional love towards a deity, Krishna, Shiva, Kali, Durga, Ganesh, anyone else, really, like anybody. Though it's associated with Hinduism, you could also consider any religion where the devotion to God is the focus as a bhakti path. Christianity, right? That's bhakti yoga. Yoga obviously means connection or to come into union. So bhakti yoga means you're coming into union with God through devotional practices or simply through devotion or love. You're merging with the beloved, with God, with Bhagwan. And like most spiritual paths, bhakti ultimately leads to unity, to non-duality, to Advaita Vedanta. Non-duality is something that always starts as a thought experiment, right? I think it has to start as it's an intellectual idea. It's the idea that all distinctions between ourselves and others or subject and object are illusory, and that everything's ultimately one thing, that separateness is an illusion. The word illusory or illusion is used specifically in this instance because an illusion is anything that is or is likely to be wrongly perceived by the senses. You see, it's the reality testing function of a human ego that gives the illusion of separateness, right? It's the reality testing piece is the one that lets you know you're not the chair you're sitting in. And this illusion is something that the organism does. It's not the soul, right? Separateness has to be perceived by the organism in order to propagate the species. Never forget, there are biological imperatives associated with the organism that you as a soul are inhabiting. And something I have found very helpful in understanding this concept of non-duality is to think of it like fingers on a hand, right? Each finger is separate, but they're all connected to the same hand and ultimately the same body. And I believe that Advaita Vedanta, non-duality, whatever we're calling it, is something that if you're just going to think about it and treat it as a thought experiment from time to time, then I don't think that you'll really have those unity consciousness experiences. I believe that this thing I told you about the fingers in the hand, spend time in contemplation of that. And to really spend time kind of, I can't say it other than to just stare at your hand. I've done it for so long and just thought of it that way, that I believe that it's not just considering it from time to time, thinking of it from time to time. I don't believe that helps. I believe contemplation is what's really needed. And when it comes to this, we read about this concept of non-duality in most spiritual documents, right? For instance, in the Bhagavad Gita, which I'm very familiar with, it's the only one I really feel truly, totally comfortable speaking on. Krishna speaks extensively about returning to unity or Brahman. He also states that we are all his parts and parcels. He mentions that he, Vishnu, the sustaining aspect of God or source, is in each and every living thing. If that's the case, everyone contains a piece of Krishna or God within them. As living beings and more deeply as souls, we are inextricably connected to God, or to go a step further, we are one with God, that we are one and the same. That we are reflections of God or created in God's image, meaning that we share the same divine spiritual nature as God. And perceiving the divine in all things is known as it's called equal vision. And it's one of those benefits of a dedicated spiritual practice. And of course, you're going to wane in and out of it, right? Depending on the mood. And, once we begin recognizing this, right, we begin recognizing that everyone holds a piece of Krishna or the super soul within them, that they too are part and parcel of the divine. They too are inextricably connected to Brahman, the cosmos, to us. Something shifts, right? I can't explain it other than it just feels different. It doesn't mean, again, that you just float through life, but I've said this before, it takes the sharp edges out of it. I've often talked about my experiments with this over the years on this podcast, especially when it comes to being patient with others, cultivating compassion for others in the world. It's not easy. It's possible. And like most things, it's hard in some ways and very easy in other ways. Now, while non-duality may start as a thought experiment, at some point along the path, we begin to have what could be considered unity consciousness experiences. These are moments when the veil drops and we sense a connection to everything. And it's a very numinous and overwhelming experience. But it's not where we're meant to stay. Remember that. We only get to visit that space. And we only get to visit while we're in the human form, right? And while we may have these extraordinary mystical experiences, that's not where our work lies on this plane, right? Remember, we are in the world, but not of the world. And you have to do both. The work is in the human body. Also, something else that I'd like you to remember is that having these experiences will not create lasting change. Those are just signs of land, so to speak. They let us know that we're on the right track. We have to maintain a practice that keeps these ideas or these realizations that we gain during these unity consciousness moments. These practices help keep that stuff at the forefront of our thinking because, again, that is the work of the human incarnation. You're not getting out of this thing. You're in a body. You're here. So how does this relate to partnership with another person, to falling in love or to romance? Well, if we are going to buy in and commit to this spiritual path, then we need to start engaging with these ideas. The other day I was speaking with a client and we were discussing japa. The point I was making in this discussion was that if we're going to chant these sacred sounds, right, and want these changes in our lives that come from chanting these names of God, then we need to play the game fully. We need to fully invest. We need to treat our mala, for instance, with respect. Buy in, right? Everything is weird until it's not. And everything that we perceive is just a habit. So if we habitually perceive something as nothing, as meaningless, then we can habitually perceive something as very valuable. We need to treat our mala with respect. We need to treat books with respect. So if we want the sacred, like we want the sacred in our lives, then we need to create a space where the sacred can manifest. And we do that not only through our thoughts, but also through our actions. We have to act as if these things matter. Act as if this string of beads made of tulsi wood is important. Don't throw your beads on the floor. Don't wear them like jewelry. Don't throw books on the ground. Don't do any of that stuff. And really what this starts to become is our karma, right? Remember, karma is not what's happening. Karma is how the mind relates to what's happening. both good and bad, right? We can create good karma. We can create negative karma. So it's not the mala itself or the sounds themselves. It's how the mind relates to these things, how the mind regards, understands, and interprets them. And now we're back to how the mind perceives. Perception, regarding, understanding, interpreting. And because perception is reality. We've all heard it. So as we move along our spiritual journey and we start to have these experiences, we start to hear more about the concept of non-dualism. Either we start to experience it on some level, or we just kind of intellectually start to see how it's possible based on the literature that we've read, and in turn believe it, even if only in the most basic way. Once we reach that point, we will feel compelled to apply it to our relationships. Now, you might get excited and want to apply this to people you're not crazy about, because nobody wants enemies. Nobody wants to deal with this. We've all had that thought, like, if I could just see them as God. I'd say pump the brakes. Let's start with the easy stuff. Trying to apply this to people that you might not care for is a bit steep and probably a really great way to get discouraged. Ultimately, we'd all love to move through the world with peace and kindness, but let's not get ahead of ourselves, right? Let's give ourselves a fighting chance by applying this non-dualist way of perceiving to those we care about the most. Let's find unity with them first. It's always this way, with Americans, right? We love to throw the hammer down and take the more is more approach. But with this, trust me, go slow. Now, think about what I said about the beads, right? About the mala. We treat them as sacred. We create a space where the sacred can manifest. We treat them with respect, and we do that so that we can experience the benefits of that practice. Well, why wouldn't we do that with our partner? Given everything we know about the soul, about God, we see that this is simply an issue with perception. If we want this deep, rewarding spiritual connection with this person that we love, then why wouldn't we treat them as if they were also God? Why wouldn't we perceive them this way? After all, they have the same divine nature as God, right? They're the same as us. This is, again, the benefit of a regular practice. We practice remembering. We practice equal vision. Things like equal vision aren't cities. They're not powers. They're not mystical whatever. It's a habit. You have a habit of considering equal vision. Think of it that way. So for me, every morning I wake up and I make coffee for Krishna. It's a sacred thing. I bring the coffee upstairs to God. She is just as much God as I am. She too is inextricably connected to Source. Just like when Christy makes dinner or makes smoothies, she treats it as a sacred duty. She's making food for the divine. That's what's meant by Namaste. The divine in me bows in recognition to the divine in you. It's not just something you say at the end of your yoga class before you go get your acai bowl. It means something. It's not just some salutation. It's a concept. It's the beginning of yoga, which I find ironic that they say it at the end, but it's the recognition of Advaita Vedanta, non-duality, one thing. Trauma responses, anxiety, ruminating thinking, grief and loss, stress, these are all reoccurring patterns in the mind. They're often the result of reacting the same way over and over again. Why do we do this? Because the mind believes the past is still here, happening now, causing the nervous system to respond accordingly. What the mind perceives, the body feels. Mind transformation and restructuring, MTR, offers a pathway to release these patterns. It guides both the mind and the nervous system out of these repetitive cycles and into a lighter, freer way of being. If this resonates with you, feel free to reach out via direct message or through the contact section at theinfinitesparkofbeing.com. You don't have to live the way you've been living. Change is possible. Now, before too many of you get caught up in the terms, right, God and goddess, be careful not to anthropomorphize God or to apply human attributes to something that's clearly not human. When, the distinction that's being made, right, in the texts between God and goddess, remember, it's a reference to energy. Feminine and masculine is a reference to energetic poles, not dicks and pussies. These are not biological distinctions, they're energetic distinctions, if there are distinctions at all. So, like Krishna and Radha are one. Radha represents, I'll say represents, that'd be easier for some folks. Radha represents the potency of God. They are both God. They are both Vishnu. They are two aspects of the same thing, specifically the sustaining aspect of God, Vishnu. Over the last handful of years, we've heard a lot about connecting with our divine feminine or our divine masculine, but it's often presented in this really egocentric, new age kind of way. It's making separations. It's dividing things up again, which is fine when you're dealing with the material plane, but it doesn't work that way on a spiritual plane. The mind looks for separation because it has the ego to contend with. Again, it's the reality testing function of the human ego that creates the separation. The soul, however, doesn't do that. The divine mind doesn't do that. But like I keep saying, we have to do both, right? And let's face it, a lot of these new age concepts are in response to feeling less than. We're only using the term divine masculine because a bunch of guys with wellness pages on Instagram felt left out of a conversation that's being perpetuated by individuals who are flippantly using terms that they do not fully understand. And not to leave anybody out, but divine feminine is being self-applied by women who are clearly disillusioned by the beauty culture that they've been buying into for years. They often blame men for these so-called beauty standards when meanwhile, all we really wanted for y'all to do was to take your makeup off, throw on a t-shirt, a pair of sweatpants, and take a walk with us. That's it. That's all we ever wanted. Stop blaming the fellas. It's so fucking sad. But the egoism of the new age culture has really permeated the yoga world. And why wouldn't it? Right? As Westerners, we've been brainwashed into this perception of God that's more like an angry dad than a loving parent or even the source of all life. It's also separate. It's also ego, right? To take God out of you, to remove God from your very being, to remove yourself from God. Again, reality testing. When you are seeing God that way, when you're not understanding your unity with God, you are actively perceiving God through the ego. That's it. I don't know what else to tell. That might be harsh. I'm trying to be nice. One of my favorite little games to play with someone who's lecturing me about God, like I'm doing with you, is to ask them whether or not God is omnipresent. Of course, I usually have to explain what omnipresent means, but once I do, they agree. God is everywhere, within and without. That's what omnipresent means. And once they agree, I ask, does God stop just shy of my body? Well, of course not. Okay, so does God stop just shy of a tree? And this is usually where you start to see the wheels turning, And then I ask, why don't you tell me where God stops and starts? You tell me where God can't exist. You tell me about God's limits since you're the expert. Since you've obviously spent so much time contemplating God and obviously not simply sitting there taking directions from someone. This is when the fun usually begins. I'm joking. It's not fun. They usually get mad. It's a horrible way to confront somebody, but I've got my own, I've got my stuff, right? Anyway, I bring coffee to God. She cooks for God, and we make love to God. God doesn't just stop shy of the human body, like Prabhupada used to say. With a proper microscope, the human body doesn't even exist. All those molecules, all those atoms, they're empty. There's nothing inside of them. But emptiness isn't really empty. It's filled with something. And if God is omnipresent, guess what? That's right. It's filled with God. The statues and images of gods and goddesses are meant to create a sense of closeness. They understood that humans needed to see images. We anthropomorphize everything. And being able to look at a statue that's an anthropomorphized version of God or a painting or whatever, that they knew that it would deepen our bhakti practice. So we channel our love for God into these images. And that makes them just as good and just as worthy. Remember, God doesn't stop just shy of a statue. So at that point, what's the difference in a statue of God and a hubcap, right? Well, that question takes us to intention. It takes us to perception and channeling. These are things you can work with, things you can control. They're subjective and they're up to you. Yes, they take practice, but that's true of everything. About the word channeling that I just used, I'm using it deliberately. And it's not the same as projecting. Projecting is something we do unconsciously, but to channel is something that we do deliberately and consciously. Now, if you apply that intention and perception and channel your devotion into your partner, right? What if you did that? What if you recognized them as God, or at least recognized the piece of them that is God, that's the same piece of you, that you've got the same thing happening? This isn't easy. It's challenging and sometimes even extremely difficult, but you practice. You create space in the mind where the sacred can live, where it can grow. And you might say, I don't have those feelings for God. I don't have these loving devotional feelings for God. Well, isn't that interesting? Fascinating. Is your love for God out of fear? Is it a transaction where you worship so that God doesn't let anything bad happen to you? Is it the God of cash and prizes? If that's the case, you're operating in the realm of the Abrahamic religions, which makes sense, as many of us are taught that from an early age as Westerners. It's part of our Judeo-Christian indoctrination that happens in this country. But if that's your relationship with God, I encourage you to read the Bhagavad Gita, read the Ramayana, read the Vishnu Purana. There are other ways. There are different ways to relate to God. Now, think about the description of God that many of us were raised with: vengeful, jealous, commanding us to do what I say or else, right? Now, think about how that perspective mirrors in our relationships. Whether it's parents and children, husband and wife, boyfriend and girlfriend, business owner and employees, they often reflect this cultural influence, right? Created in God's image, remember? And there's that Joseph Campbell quote that I love so much. Your God is a reflection of your own consciousness. Or we could say that your relationship with God, your perception of God, the way you regard, understand, and interpret God is a reflection of your own consciousness. What you perceive, you will experience. How you do one thing is how you do a lot of things, right? Consciousness, what you are aware of and unaware of. Consciousness is a cognitive faculty, not as a big C consciousness. So, in my experience of being in a relationship where a spiritual perspective is first and foremost, taking my love for Krishna and channeling it towards things like bringing Christy coffee, getting her yoga bag together, making the bed, anything, it adds a layer of sweetness to the relationship. And it's brought me even closer to God, actually. And that sounds counterintuitive too, because I can hear somebody of a different stripe saying something like, well, if I'm worshiping my girlfriend, then I can hear it. And I'm sure many of you are rolling your eyes, and that's to be expected. But I also performed this thought experiment in my 20s while working as a banquet waiter. I was serving food to God. I would imagine that everyone at the table was Krishna. I used to try to do this with my mom, but that was a little harder. I'd even try in traffic, and again, very difficult. But like I was saying before, start with easy things. As a waiter, it was easy because I didn't know any of the people I was serving, and nothing bad was really happening, so it wasn't hard to see them as divine. But I believe that early thought experiment helped shape my ability to be in this relationship that I have now, where it's a daily practice. Another time in my life where conscious channeling came into play was when I was really working hard to cultivate compassion for others. I started with something familiar, right? Like that feeling you get when you're at a party and you don't really know anyone, but then you see someone you kind of know, you feel a bit of relief, and their familiarity makes you feel more comfortable. So I'd walk down the street and channel that feeling into the people I saw. And what I found was that everyone started to feel like a friend. That practice benefited me because I had better experiences. And that's what we're really trying to do here on the most basic level. And, some days we're connected, some days we're not. That's part of the human deal, is that you go in and out of it. But if you have it at the foundation, on the worst day, the most materialistic day, the day that you're truly in the world, you still have that, right? Spiritual immunity. We talked about mental immunity. It's spiritual immunity, right? And it ultimately creates a much better experience. That's it. Start with that. In fact, if God is too heavy of a concept, forget it. What if you channeled your love for your mother or your father or even your pets into others? Like, what would the experience be? How would it change things? And don't dismiss that. I know I can hear it, probably because I'm paranoid, but don't dismiss things that you don't try. If, there's nothing worse than somebody who wants to change everything, but isn't even willing to do the easiest, slightest, silliest thing. You don't even have to take it seriously. Just give it a shot. I think it was last week when I was talking about like people that go, I never see anything in the sky. It's like, do you ever sit and look at it? Or do you just look up once and go, whoop, nothing, and go inside your house? That's not going to get you anywhere. So really, if we work with the mind, this all becomes devotional practice. This all becomes bhakti yoga. We begin to bow to the divine in everything. And yes, being in a conscious relationship with someone who has agreed to wake up through this process is beneficial, but that's not what everybody gets. I mean, we don't see it anyway, right? We don't see that the pain of loss is also God, right? But maybe it's a coworker, a friend, your parents, or even your pets. They're all part and parcel of God. They're all created in God's image, and they all have that same spiritual identity you do, and you are all inextricably connected to God. God does not stop just shy of your pain and suffering or your grief. And God certainly doesn't stop just shy of the people you love the most, right? As within, so without, as above, so below. I love you. I love you. I love you. You and I have been doing this for a very long time. We are old friends. Thank you, thank you, thank you. If you enjoyed this content and would like to support its creation, visit theinfinitesparkofbeing.com. There you can explore the various ways to get involved and support this work. Click the About button, read a little bit about me, and see what I have to offer you through the one-on-one sessions. Don't forget to check out the Patreon tiers, where we're building a community of everyday people with not so everyday interests. You'll also find the online apparel store. And as always, head over to the Participate button and join us. Together, we're growing a community of spiritual seekers just like you.